Hi, I'm Dr. Ray Baker. I'm here at Appomattox Courthouse in the American state of Virginia. This is an important place in American history because it was here that the U.S. Civil War ended in April 1865. At that time, about half the population of Appomattox County were slaves. Here you can see what the slave quarters looked like back then, although I suspect that they look a lot better now than they did back in 1865. Now, before modern times, slavery was a virtually universal phenomenon. It existed in all cultures of the ancient world, and the slave trade continued around the world well into modern times. And to a certain extent, it continues today with trafficking and slave-like working conditions for far too many people in our world. Since slavery was a universal phenomenon, it's not surprising that slavery is also found in the Bible. The fact that the biblical authors do not speak out explicitly against slavery or for the abolition of the slave trade has been used as an argument against the Christian faith. In a conversation with Ben Shapiro, the atheist philosopher Sam Harris says this:
The Bible, in my view, can't be the real repository of our moral wisdom in any sense, because when you go to read it, you are forced to ignore certain passages or reinterpret them rather aggressively to conform to what you now in the 21st century have every reason to believe is good or a direction worth going socially. So, it is just an inconvenient fact that slavery is endorsed in the Bible. It's explicitly endorsed in the Old Testament, and it's certainly not repudiated in the New, right? And Jesus told slaves to serve their masters and to serve their Christian masters especially well. So there's no place in the Bible where you can get a truly compelling case against slavery, because the creator of the universe clearly expected slavery to be a human institution.
Well, except for abolition.
Sam Harris develops these ideas in his book, Letter to a Christian Nation, where he writes, "Consider the question of slavery. The entire civilized world now agrees that slavery is an abomination. What moral instruction do we get from the God of Abraham on this subject? Well, consult the Bible, and you will discover that the creator of the universe clearly expects us to keep slaves." But admitting that something bad exists is not the same thing as endorsing it or condoning it. Just like our Congress recognizes that there is such a thing as domestic violence and alcohol abuse, that's why we have laws about these things. It's not the same thing as endorsing it. Now, Sam continues and says that he wishes that the Ten Commandments also had something like, "Thou shalt not own slaves." Well, the fact of the matter is that Moses never did say that in the Ten Commandments. But in the very next chapter of the Bible, he does say this: "Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him, shall be put to death." I think that's pretty clear. So how shall we Christians today relate to what the Bible says about slavery? For now, I just want to focus on the Hebrew Scriptures and not so much on what the New Testament says or on what the Christian church or Christian individuals have done historically to fight for the abolition of the slave trade. Now, when we talk about slavery in the Bible, we must be careful with our definitions. It's easy for us to take our ideas about the barbaric enslavement of people with African heritage that took place in places like this here in the American South, and then to project them onto the biblical text. Here it is important to understand the original context and not let our ideas about the North Atlantic slave trade color our views of the world of the Bible. The Hebrew word ebed, which is generally translated as slave, is actually a neutral word. It does not have the negative associations that we get from the word slave. It appears more than 800 times in the Hebrew Bible. Moses is called an ebed, as are Abraham, Joshua, David, Job, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Zerubbabel, who was the governor of Judah after the exile in Babylonia. He was even the grandson of the last king of Judah. The suffering servant in Isaiah 53, that Christians interpret as Jesus Christ, is also called an Ebed. In ancient Israel and Judah, poverty or destitution was the most common reason for becoming a slave or an unfree laborer. Israelites who found themselves in difficult financial situations had the option of temporarily selling themselves into slavery. Now, this was definitely considered a last resort, and there were several preventive measures in place to help people avoid this situation. For example, landowners were not allowed to harvest their crops the whole way to the edge of the field. This was so that the poor people could come along and gather the grain there and make a living for themselves. And people who lent money were also to do so without charging interest. It's important to point out here that it was the labor that was sold and not the person. In exchange for redeeming a debt, the master gained control over the debtor's land, and the bondservant would work for his master for a maximum of 6 years. In the 7th year, the debts were to be written off, and the land was to be returned to its original owners, and the bondservant was to be set free. And upon liberation, he was also to receive gifts from his master in order to have some money to start off his new life. Now, there are some major differences between the slavery that we had here in the United States and the slavery in the Hebrew Scriptures. Perhaps the biggest difference was that the North Atlantic slave trade was race-based. White Europeans and North Americans captured black Africans, who often in turn had been kidnapped and trafficked by Africans from other tribes, and brought them to the New World here under horrific conditions. Slavery in biblical times was not race-based. In the Hebrew Bible, we see examples of Hebrews being sold into slavery in Egypt, such as Joseph in the book of Genesis, and an Egyptian woman, Hagar, who was an unfree worker for Abraham and Sarah. Unfree workers in the Old Testament also had certain legal rights that African slaves in North America did not have. For instance, they were not allowed to be sold to other slave owners. They were entitled to a Sabbath day of rest each week. They were not to be held in chains. Their children were not automatically made slaves. Slaves in the Bible were given protection from sexual abuse, and servants could inherit from their masters. Abraham lamented the fact that his servant Eliezer of Damascus would inherit Abraham's estate because Abraham at that point had no children. Servants were trusted by their masters, and Abraham sent a servant on a journey with 10 camels and a lot of money in order to find a wife for his son Isaac. Abraham even gave him a weapon. Slaves in the Old Testament were not to be subjected to physical abuse. In fact, they could sue their master. Now, this was unique in ancient Israel. In other ancient cultures, a slave owner could sue another person who abused his slaves, but nowhere else could slaves hold their masters accountable. If a master mistreated his worker so that he lost an eye or a tooth, then the bondservant in the Bible was to be set free. And a servant who was mistreated by his master had the chance to flee and to seek asylum in a nearby village. The Israelites were to take care of runaway slaves. And the reason for this was that the Israelites themselves had previously been mistreated as slaves in Egypt. Do not return a slave to his master when he has escaped from his master to you. Let him live among you wherever he wants within your city gates. Do not mistreat him. In contrast, we see how runaway slaves in the United States were to be returned to their owners or killed. And anyone who harbored a runaway slave could also be killed. In principle, all this stuff looks good. But when we read through the Bible, we see that the Israelites were not very good at following God's law. So it's not obvious that unfree workers were actually treated as well as all of this. But at least this is the principle or the ideal. And it's perhaps precisely because of this natural human tendency to be selfish and to try to exploit others that the Bible provides rules on how unfree labor should be treated. Now, this same idea underlies the labor laws and the rights of workers that we have today, protecting anyone who is in a dependent relationship. Although the law of Moses does not specifically call for the abolition of slavery, the restrictions and rights that are there indicate a countercultural trajectory that continues into the New Testament and then into modern times. Jesus says that he has come, among other things, to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and the recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free. The New Testament explicitly condemns kidnappers and slave traders and says that they are ungodly and sinful and they act contrary to sound doctrine. The New Testament urges slaves to free themselves if they can and insists that no one should choose to become a slave. The early Christians lacked influence in Roman society where they could abolish slavery and change such a deeply entrenched social structure. The Christians were few in number, and many of them were slaves themselves. Nevertheless, Paul appealed to Philemon to pardon the runaway slave Onesimus and to welcome him as a beloved brother. In 115 AD, the churches established a special fund to pay for the release of slaves. In a decree dated the 18th of April, 321 AD, Constantine the emperor gave the bishops the authority to free slaves at the expense of the church. This gave former slaves full rights as Roman citizens, which was actually a big deal since people were not automatically born as Roman citizens. The foundation that was laid in the law of Moses eventually led to the abolition of slavery, something that the church fathers, the councils, and reform movements fought for, based on their Bible-based convictions about the equal value and equal rights of all people as created in the image of God. Now, I began by quoting Sam Harris, but I wonder why Sam objects so much to slavery. I mean, it was ubiquitous in the ancient world. The basis for human equality, dignity, and human rights comes from the Bible, not from a naturalistic worldview with its ideas of utilitarianism and the survival of the fittest. In the natural world, the stronger creatures get what they want, even at the expense of the weak. In fact, I suspect that much of Darwin's ideas about natural selection and the survival of the fittest was actually a pseudo-scientific attempt at legitimizing the British practice of subjugating and exploiting black and brown peoples in its worldwide empire. In the Bible, on the other hand, we read that humans are created in God's image and that they therefore have great value regardless of sex, skin color, ethnicity, and economic status. Paul writes that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. It's clear that slavery was a major problem throughout most of human history, and trafficking and modern slavery are still an abomination. And I condemn this slavery and the historic institution of slavery in North America in no uncertain terms. But I am also impressed and grateful for the work of the International Justice Mission and other Christian organizations that around the world that are fighting for social justice on biblical grounds. But when I think about slavery, whether we're talking about ancient Israel or the American South or even current situations in many places around the world, I'm reminded of the fact that none of us is completely free. All of us who work for someone else have certain duties that limit our freedom. We're expected to go to work, show up, do our job, and many employees even have to sign NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, that limit what they can say about the work that they do. The soldiers who fought on the fields here of Virginia were not free. They had to obey orders from their commanders. And the same is true of the men and the women in the military today. But we do not consider this lack of freedom to be morally reprehensible. The relationship between an employer and an employee, or a soldier and his or her commanding officer, is not wrong in itself, but it can easily be exploited. And that's why we have laws that regulate all these things. The Portuguese soccer superstar Cristiano Ronaldo recently signed a contract with a team in Saudi Arabia for an estimated 200 million euros per year, plus a 100 million euro bonus just for signing the contract. Now, he hasn't shown me his contract, so I don't know the details, but I think that we can safely assume that it's a contract of many pages with lots of fine print regulating everything that he can and cannot do, and what happens if he fails to fulfill his obligations, and under what circumstances he can terminate the contract. But is he free? The Bible describes the human condition like this: we are either slaves to sin or slaves to righteousness. Do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to righteousness? But thanks be to God that you who were once slaves of sin have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching of which you were committed, and having been set free from sin, have become slaves of righteousness. I'm speaking in human terms because of your natural limitations. For just as you once presented your members as slaves to impurity and to lawlessness, leading to more lawlessness, so now present your members as slaves to righteousness, leading to sanctification.